founder of Terra, the education management tool for schools. And I am here as part of our ATL Education Expo Insight Conversation series with none other than Ray James, the assistant principal of the new KIPP Academy here in Metro Atlanta. Ray, thank you for being with us for this conversation.
What's up, brother?
So what we're going to do in this conversation is start by just, we'd love to hear your story, your background. How did you get into education? And then what was that journey like in and through and around Metro Atlanta? I know you just recently came back to Metro Atlanta, so we'll get into that as well. But what got you into education in the first place?
Initially, when I was getting ready to graduate undergrad, I had no clue what I was going to do. And it was between the Air Force and graduate school. And I didn't really want to fly planes for real. I was just like, I know it'll be a job and I can have like a solid career.
Sure.
And ended up getting like a decent score on the GRE. By decent, I do mean basic. And went to grad school actually for higher education at men because I just had so much fun in college. And I wanted to provide those services to kids. I was like, yo, this is dope. Sure. I can like work with kids, work with college kids. I think the coolest people in the world are college kids. And I ended up, it was like spring 2012, and I ended up going to a conference out in Phoenix, Arizona. It was the NASPA conference, and NASPA is like a national organization for higher ed, and John Legend was the keynote speaker. And at the time, John Legend was on the national board for Teach for America. And he essentially was talking about like the services and the things that co-curricular services do is great and spectacular and develop kids and make people think different thoughts and have different career interests. But he was like, it's so many people and so many Black and brown kids that are not making it to college to get those services. And legit, I had accepted a job at Kansas State University that morning. And that afternoon, I was Googling what the heck is Teach for America, and ended up getting into TFA. Got placed in Atlanta, and it's been a crazy journey. Started out in Clayton County, Lake City Elementary School, teaching fourth graders. Like somehow somebody said I could teach reading and writing. So I was teaching ELA fourth grade, and then ended up being with KIPP, KIPP Metro Atlanta at KIPP Vision Academy for a year, and then ended up being a turnaround teacher with APS at Scott Elementary. So was able to navigate a lot of different schools in the city. Also, just in terms of like my journey, some things that I did to like further develop myself. I had a fellowship with Leadership for Educational Equity, and I was working, it was a policy and advocacy fellowship. And I actually got to do some research and work with APS's innovation team, which do a lot of things with the charter schools in the city. And learned a lot of good stuff, found out some stuff. And I also was involved with Lee and their organizing arm and helped to co-found One Atlanta, which is now ACE Atlanta. The name has since changed. And that was super, super fun. Made a lot of good connections that I still am connected to today. And then once I left Atlanta, moved to New Jersey. New Jersey is worlds of difference away from, especially Newark, New Jersey, is so different from Atlanta.
Right.
While I was up there, I didn't really get a chance to get involved in the community, which is kind of what brought me back to Atlanta. But the school I was at, I'll say this now and probably for a long time, it was one of the best schools, I think, in America in terms of culture and academics and just like kid freedom and kid ownership of a building and ownership of their learning. I taught 7th and 8th grade ELA while I was there. I served as a director of extended learning and was able to flesh out and build out a lot of clubs, and like even the club culture and sports culture is different in New Jersey as opposed to like what I've seen in Atlanta anyway. And I also was a grade level chair, and grade level chair position at this school is a lot like on paper, I was an assistant principal, but by title, I was a grade level chair.
Got it.
And ended up coming back to Atlanta, like truly behind the scenes was like my wife got a job at the Atlanta Speech School, and then I had to find a job. But the other part was when I started thinking about where I wanted to go, I knew that if I wanted to come back to Atlanta, I didn't want to go back into a system that I didn't think was working. And just so happened, the school founder, Amy Bryson, she had worked in KIPP, New Jersey. And so we knew each other from there. And once I found out she was opening up a school in Atlanta, we connected. I was able to interview, and I guess the rest is, pandemic history now.
Yeah, for real. Awesome. Well, there's a lot you just packed in, so I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Trying to see if I can figure out this echo we got going on. Let me try. While I ask this question, let me try muting you and see if gets rid of that echo. Okay. Yeah. So there's four things I want to touch on from there, but I want to go back to the beginning of your story and actually touch on what led you to change directions and become a teacher in the first place. I actually had a similar experience. I accepted a job in the private sector, signed on the dotted line, and then got exposed to TFA by some TFA teachers here in Atlanta. And then once I got to meet some students and really realized like, all right, I could work with students. Like I was really nervous about it, like a lot of us are. But I also kind of changed directions. And I'm finding there's kind of two types of teachers I'm running into, especially through these conversations. There's one who's like always wanted to be a teacher. That was their thing. They knew from day one, setting foot in, high school or college, that they wanted to be an educator. And then there are a lot of us who have similar stories where it's like we had a late game pivot right before the end of college. And so I'm curious, what do you think is driving that? Like, what made that pivot for you? You mentioned the John Legend story and realizing that you wanted to get kind of higher up in the pipeline before kids get to higher ed. But I also want to ask, now you've been in and around the system, what do you think is holding back interest in becoming teachers? Right now, I think that's the average the number of applicants for graduate programs for teaching has dropped like 33% over the last 5 or 10 years. And that doesn't surprise any of us who are in education, right? And so I'm curious, like, what's your thoughts about like getting more teachers in the classroom? Why is it not more enticing at this point?
I think for multiple reasons. One of the biggest things is the pay. Point blank period. Teachers do not make enough money for the hours that they work. Whenever people see me and see, and like my AP workflow is a little bit different, a little bit more than what teaching was, but I think being a teacher is harder than being an assistant principal.
Sure.
And the amount of work, because teaching is the one job that if you don't do work outside of work, you can't do work at work. Like
Right.
it just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And whether it is grading, whether it is lesson planning, whether it is talking with families, you cannot do that stuff when you are teaching.
Right.
Whereas like now as AP, like my schedule's flexible. I can talk, I can plan, I can do all this stuff in the day. Whereas like teachers, you just don't get to do it. And for what they pay teachers is like, I'm from Louisiana, like where teachers make like $30,000 a year. Like the amount of side hustles that I know personally with folks, it's ridiculous. And the other thing that we used to have a running joke at school I was at in Jersey was like, yo, people are not knocking down doors to become teachers. It's just not going to happen. Yeah. And the other thing that I think that why I think something that gets people in and keeps them in is me and some of my buddies talk about this sometimes. Enough people don't see the matrix. And what I mean by that is enough people don't see how the society we live in, the thoughts we think, all of that kind of the inception of all of that is like the schools you go to. Yeah. Like even when I think about my daughter, she's 5, and the things that she's learning and not learning are teaching her so much about the world and who she is and who she will become, who she should hang out with, what she should think of certain foods, what she should think of certain lifestyles, whatever the case may be. All of that is happening in a school. Yes, home is the first school, parents, yada, yada, yada. Yes, I get that. But when I think about it, like I've never taught my daughter the Pledge of Allegiance, yet she knows it verbatim because her school taught it to her. Yeah. So now she's having certain ideals and thoughts permeate her mind. And before I started to somewhat see the matrix and kind of be able to connect the dots, like I never would have thought being a teacher would be anything. And even like my first year or two in the classroom, I can't say I fully saw the matrix, but doing a lot of reading that I've done and a lot of just life experiences too, it's like, yo, the system, W.B. Du Bois, I believe, said, I believe it's W.B. Du Bois, a system cannot fail those it was never meant to protect. And so when I think about like the matrix, I'm like, oh, like, no, like our communities are not suffering because of XYZ. It's like, it was it's doing what it was built to do.
Right.
I think enough people don't see that and or know that and or some people just don't care.
Yeah, I mean, it's so fascinating. I've never heard anybody refer to it like that, but it resonates a lot. I get the Matrix vibe because, and this is what, as we're out here trying to get more people to think about education in a more urgent way, right? Because education, I was talking with somebody last week, and it's very similar to climate change in that it's having such a massive impact, but nobody sees it in their like everyday experience. But it's probably the key to everything else. And it certainly underpins everything else, right? Everything from the economy to
Yes.
how we treat each other, to how we view rights, how we view all these things, tolerance, whatever. It's seeded as a child, as your worldview is shaped by your educational experiences. And I'm curious, like, why do you think people don't get that? Where's the disconnect here?
A lot of it does start and end like at home. And so like it's funny, we were talking about this the other day, and like you don't know what you don't know, first and foremost. And so when we think about like the reason people don't see it is because like a lot of times like folks parents don't know. Like when I think about like my parents, both my parents are college educated. Like my dad played college basketball, my mom went to college, they met in college, but because they didn't learn certain things, they didn't know to teach me certain things. And so
Mhm.
certain lessons and certain just aspects of history and of the nation and of the world that I had to go out and learn on my own, because it's stuff that I tell my parents to this day, and they're like, "What? That
Right.
happened in the '60s, or what? That happened in the
Sure.
1800s?" And I'm like, "Yo, like you were living, or like this happened
Right.
before
Right.
you." Um, and it's
Yeah.
just it's miseducation and lack of education. Because folks are taught like I had to give some feedback to my daughter's school in Jersey, because they were still celebrating like Columbus Day. And it's like, yo, it's 20 at the time, it was 2019 or 2020. And I'm like, yo, this is like a fact. It was 2019. I'm like, yo, this is a proven fact. Like, y'all know this really didn't happen the way y'all are telling it, but y'all are still making a conscious choice to tell little kids
Right.
this. And now somebody
You know,
has to undo that.
Yeah, now that you say it, I think because there's this other thing that's happening in education too, where it's so much focus on credentials, and
Yep.
like and it's why like kids get diplomas. If you pull a kid out of APS who has a diploma and pull a kid out of Montana who has a diploma, like you couldn't tell the difference just by looking
Mm-mm.
at diplomas. And I think to your point, a lot of us don't even think back to our own experiences and think about how so much of what we think was shaped based off of growing up. And I think that's because, as you gain self-awareness, you probably have this, we all think we are much more control of our thoughts and our biases than we are. And I think today, given the conversations around race, fortunately, people are starting to realize what bias means just generally. And hopefully
Yep.
that'll start to deconstruct some of this other stuff. But you're absolutely right. I feel like a lot of parents, I'm not a parent, but my three brothers are. And obviously, my parents went to college, similar to yours. And um, it's like you kind of view education retrospectively. It's like, yeah, I just did that. You do that and you get out
Yep.
because it's a means to an end. But there's a lot that happens during that time, right? This is like
Yep.
6 to age 21, 22 if you go to college or post grad. And so yeah, I'm just like, what do you think it would take to kind of break through this and get more people to really see like, wow, this is having a huge impact?
Um, in order to get people to see it, I honestly, I mean, this is the most radical thought that I think on a daily basis. The system needs to like crumble fully. I think the pandemic started like it the pandemic somewhat was like the iceberg.
Sure.
In my opinion, it was the iceberg that hit Titanic. It disrupted everything. Nobody was thinking, like people saw it.
Right.
People could have done something about it, but we kept going on the course. And you look at where we are now, like we proved that standardized testing doesn't matter last year because
Yeah.
nobody took it and nothing bad
All
happened.
still here.
We are somewhat, yeah, we're somewhat proving that right now because like the state superintendent of Georgia, like he's like, yo, I don't want kids that have been virtual to have to come to school to take a state test. You're
Right.
proving that we don't need it.
Yeah.
And like I think if the funding models were to change in education, like you mentioned teacher credentials, if that was to change, you would start to see an undoing of the system as we know it, because, you know, if the system crumbles, you know, when you think about like education system from a historical perspective, like especially for Black folks in America, like the education system was literally a facet of society, like you said, a means to an end that Black folks were literally left out. It was, again, it was illegal to go to school. It was illegal to learn. And like when you think about the effects post-slavery, like, cool, you're free now, but we didn't teach you for hundreds of years. So there's generational trauma that has occurred. And now, you know, pick yourself up by the bootstraps and start learning in the system, even though we didn't teach you how to learn in the system. And for reasons like that, I'm like, yo, the system as is honestly not fixable. I think there are some things that will like chip away at it, but I truly think like we need to fully get rid of the system as we know it, and start on a completely new venture, which is like somewhat what we're doing, like founding. You know, it's like, cool, we're birthed into the system, but there are certain aspects of it that we are going to use. There's certain things that we are going to not use. There's certain risks that we're going to take, and we will, you know, either benefit from it or suffer from it later. And we'll take that because we know that like as is not going to work.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, you and I are in 100% agreement. I've been saying this for a little while now too. Like, it's not the people in the system that are the problem for the most part. It's the system itself, right? It's the structures that keep all of us. And that's why you can have these one-on-one conversations with any educator offline, and they'll tell you exactly what they think about the system itself. But it's just constraining so many of us. And so I want to ask you one more question about your, you mentioned the innovation experience with the district and what that was like. And the reason I want to ask you about it is because of just what you said. And what I believe too is like, we really need much deeper, bigger structural change to enact some serious improvements, I think. And so, you know, thinking about what innovation should mean and does mean in education, what was that experience like for you? And what do you think, like, just generally when you hear innovation in education, do you think there's some stuff that should be called that and some stuff that shouldn't? I'm just curious what your perspective on that word in the context of education really talks about.
That word is definitely loosely thrown around. I think I was somewhat surprised that the department I worked for was the Office of Innovations, because I was like, what? What I learned, I was working directly under Rebecca Kay, who was at the time in charge of policy for APS. And so, and because I was working under the Office of Innovations, I got to work with the folks that were in charge of like the approval or denial of charters within APS. And the big project that they had me work on, and I ended up writing a paper on it. I never got it published, and I never was able. I got it put out as like an op-ed, some like a couple places.
Hey, you should send it to me. We could put it up for the expo, actually.
All right, I will. It's the data in it is like 6 years old, but it's not 10 years old, so it's still valid. But the pandemic has changed everything about what data means. But I ended up doing some research around student mobility, and it was looking at student mobility from district schools versus charter schools, and the impact of student mobility is completely ridiculous. And that's one of the reasons why when I started to like see, like, you know, the matrix is like this big black thing that's in front of me, it was like a chip like broke through, and I was like,
And when you're talking about mobility, you're talking about students going from school to school or actually physically be able to get to a school? First one, right?
Student, it's a little bit of both, because students' ability to have transportation impacts their mobility within the schools. And so what we were looking at, we were comparing the charters to the district schools. And of course, the charter schools have way less student mobility in terms of students leaving the school because and needing to like pick up and start at a new one. And the impacts of it is like, cool, now I got to learn new culture, potentially a new curriculum. Like I might have been getting like grade level instruction over here. Now I'm not getting grade level instruction.
Plus so many things that social aspects too, you know, like being a kid, that's crazy.
I gotta find new friends, you know, and this was even before I started working for KIPP, which is why I was really happy to be able to like get inside of a charter and kind of see like the system from a different aspect of it. And I realized that like, yo, if a kid's address changes, which unfortunately, because of the system, a lot of students in urban cities, in major metropolises, they move around because the system is not set up for them, for their parents to have success, and therefore their parents have to move a lot, whether it's because of rent increase or whatever the case may be,
Right,
your
right.
job. And so many people have been displaced because of the pandemic. Like, I would love to see that paper written now, but I realized that, like, simply a kid changing schools impacts everything. And if a kid can stay at their school and not have to move just because their parents moved,
Right.
it changes everything. And then when you start thinking about like literal transportation, like a downfall in charter schools is like a lot of them don't have buses. And so
Right.
the
Right.
students that are more mobile, of course, are the ones that are most at risk because their parents can't get
Right.
them reliable transportation to and from the school. So they may get into a KIPP or they may get into Success Academy or any other charter system, but then if their parents can't get them to that school because it's not close, then they end up having to go back to a public school. And I'm not knocking public schools by no means, because I love public school. I'm a product of Louisiana public schools, but I recognize that, like, if kids have to change schools because of the address change, like, their whole schooling gets
Yeah.
taken away and get thrown into another system.
Right.
But when I think about like innovation in general in education, I think there's so much that can be done. I think right now we are learning so much about what it means to innovate, because like my school, we like this time last year, me and Amy were having like about twice a week, like 2 hour long calls, twice a week, talking about all the things we were going to do and how we were going to build our school to be what it needs to be. And then 2 weeks later, everything we have been talking about started changing right before our eyes. And we've pivoted our entire school and the entire vision to virtual. The good thing and something that we say is that like our school's vision did not exist within the four walls. It was like about love, it was about community, it was about passion, all our different values. And we've somewhat made those things come true. However, there are still some aspects like, if the quiet kid on Zoom that's not logging in, that is allowing you to have success as a virtual teacher, like when schools open back up, that's going to be the clown in your classroom. You're going to be like, you never said anything on Zoom.
Right.
And now I can't get you to sit down and be quiet. So I think like virtual schools for young kids have changed, have shown us that like we need to innovate more. When I think about like kids, just literally the time spent on Zoom, like for our fifth graders, their classes are 50 minutes. And most fifth graders in America don't really have solid typing skills. And so like literally their ability to like show their thinking and show their work is slowing down so much. And so I'm like, we need to be teaching keyboard and young as like 5. Like kids need to learn, like if they can work a cell phone, they can start playing with some keys. I think other things, I think something that we're doing that we're intentional about, like we realize that like fifth grade in Georgia is not a tested is not a tested subject in terms of state tests. So like our kids are getting Black history. They're learning things that I guarantee, like today they're doing a project right now and they're going over the American Revolution. But I can guarantee the average American could not tell you off the top of their head who Crispus Attucus was, or who James what's his last name? Armistead. Phyllis Wheatley might be one that they could tell you about, but like our kids are learning about that in 5th grade. And like when I think about like innovating and truly changing the system, like that's how you do it, because literally the things that our kids are learning is different.
It's interesting. I mean, I think so what I'm taking away from a lot of what you said is just the pandemic has shown us how little we really know about what works and what's good, and how all these different variables factor into. I mean, my school where I taught it was like 60 to 70% transiency, which I didn't even believe when they told me that. But then when I looked mid-year, my second year, about my diagnostic test, I said half the kids on my roster from day one were no longer there, because as teachers, you like, kid might not show up for a few days, but a new kid comes in, and before you know it, you haven't seen the first kid in 2 weeks, and they never come back. And you're absolutely right. I mean, it's one of the many big problems that when you pull back the rock and look underneath, you see it's like these things are all interconnected, and they really are disruptive for a kid. Like if they moved me jobs like that, I would, it would take me months to get up to speed, let alone feel comfortable and confident. So 100% with you there. I also think to your point, like teaching Black history, I taught world geography my first year teaching, and that's not a tested subject either. At least it wasn't at the time. And so I did all kinds of random stuff because the standards were terrible. But we spent like 2 weeks on the Arab Spring because that's when it was happening, and got to get really into that. And it's funny how we use the non-tested subjects so many times now to actually explore some new content. And I think as we think about innovation, you're right. Like content is certainly one of the areas we need to really think through long term. It's like, how can this be more relevant, more adaptive, more interesting? And, again, I think not surprisingly, like the race conversations and movements from this past couple of years are really accelerating a lot of those conversations and forcing us to look at stuff like when people talk about we need more Black history in our history classes, what that is also doing is opening the door to have similar conversations about what other things do we need in all these subjects, right? Which I think is so great. It's something that no one ever talks about or doesn't talk about enough behind like the powers of these movements. And again, it's, on the backs of the Black community being innovators as always in all that we're doing. So I want to ask you one last question before we get to the 2050 question to close it out. So you mentioned you came back to Atlanta because you were having the opportunity to start a school, and you said you weren't really interested in doing that, coming back if that was not the case. Can you tell me more about that? Because obviously you're starting KIPP Seoul, which is a new school, but at the same time it's within a KIPP network. So I'm sure there's some sort of guidelines, parameters that you guys need to meet to be a part of that. But what was it about starting a new school here in Atlanta versus joining an existing one that really was like, that was what did it for you?
The biggest thing was like getting it right from the start. I think during the pandemic and pre-pandemic, a lot of schools are constantly trying to figure out how can we clean up something? How can we make this thing better that is us? Like we created the problem and we are the problem. Yeah. And we're trying to constantly fix that. And knowing that like I had an opportunity to help found, I knew that there were certain systems that like, if we put this in the school right now, like we will reap benefits later. Like we are literally tree planters. Like, if I plant this seed right here now, this will be a tree. I might not be here to see it, but I know if I do it this way right now, it'll be good. A big thing that I saw in New Jersey was like the culture of independent reading, and then kids literal like in class productivity, not just in reading class, but in every class. And it just it was non-existent in KIPP Atlanta. And that's no shade, but like, it's just a fact. Independent reading just wasn't happening. And like, since I've been back, my school has been pushing independent reading through Accelerated Reader. We have like the most, we call them millionaires, like kids that have read a million words. We have the most millionaires in the region. We have, we're actually doing a regional competition right now. And I'm looking forward to getting a 3-foot trophy, but at the end of this week. But we also like, there was no way to like track it. And so like along with a lot of other folks worked with our tech team to like build a Tableau like reporting feature to be able to like track like how many words do the kids like quizzed on, what's their accuracy on those quizzes, when's the last time that they quizzed, that way you can hold them accountable. And like we're seeing the benefits, because like, not to like brag, but just to tell the truth, right now my school is consistently, and I know it's a pandemic so it's all different, but my school is consistently, and this is our first year, first or second in everything regionally. And I guarantee it's because we're holding our kids accountable to their independent reading, and because they're reading not vicarious, what's the word I'm looking for? Because they're reading voraciously, that's the word I'm looking for. Independently in class, they're just like, all right, cool. I just read a novel the other day. I read a 120-page book. All right, cool. Now I got 3 paragraphs to read. All right, that's easy. Or, I was reading about, this thing in my book.
Let me ask you this question, because you guys are part of a network, right? And you said this is something that was really working up in Jersey. And one of the things that we're talking constantly about for the expo, and the reason for it is like schools aren't sharing best practices a lot. And, there's reasons behind that, but I'm a little surprised to hear, like, even in a network as well known and connected as KIPP is, what preventing those best practices from being shared, or are they shared and people just don't listen because they want to do it their own way? What do you think's getting in the way of that?
I I think it's a mixture of the two. People like just don't ask and they don't know the questions to ask.
Yeah.
Um, and then the other piece is like, yo, doing school right is hard. And the reason I say that is because like when I think about like the ELA instruction that happened at my school in Jersey versus like what I knew ELA instruction to be down here, we weren't doing anything like crazy. We weren't jumping through hoops. We were just doing it right. We were like actually planning. We were actually thinking about what we were going to teach. We were actually using data. And like
Right.
we were doing the things that people say, like, yo, if you do XYZ, it's going to work. And a lot of people, unfortunately, in education, because of pay, because of the system, a lot of people are jaded and like are like, yeah, I ain't about to do all of that. Like,
Right.
I'm not
Right.
really about to grade all these kids. I'm not about to give all this individualized feedback for real. I'm gonna copy and paste some comments and drop that and move on. And
Yeah.
then like at the end of the day, you're just recycling and remaking the system, the pedagogy of the
Right.
oppressed, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And a lot of people, because of the system, a lot of people are not willing to just put in the work to do the right things for kids. And I think that that's what we're doing at my school, whether it's like a lot of people talk about anti-racism, but like, yo, are you like having PDs? Like, do you spend time with your staff actually
Right.
like digging into their work? Or is it just something you talk about like at a
It's
regional thing and everybody's fired up and then you're back to doing the same old same? So I
right.
think it's just like, yo, do the things that you know work and then things that you think can be done better, like doing better.
Yeah. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, just thinking about how much, and it's been a recurring theme, like time is always a scarce resource for educators. And,
Yep.
school days are packed to the brim with seat time, right? So there's not actually a
Mm-hmm.
ton of time to really plan. And then when you go home at night, you're not going to connect with your collaborators much. It's going to be a lot of like individual work. So you could be right. I mean, there's a ton of research about what works in education, right? Like we've been doing the same
Mm-hmm.
style of education for 100 years, so there certainly are best practices available. Now, obviously, people like us think that overall the structure should change, but that being said, we know what works in a lot of ways. Like getting kids to read more on their own and in a way that's self-directed definitely works, right? It's just, I mean, sometimes it's the simplest answer. It's just like there just isn't time. There's no time,
Yeah.
and it's
Yep.
like with the toilet paper problem with the pandemic. I remember like everybody was like, there's all these articles about like, why are people freaking out about toilet paper? Why is there toilet paper around? And then some guy wrote a little like a paragraph. He's like, well, nobody's going into work anymore, so they're all going to the bathroom at home a lot more than they were, and so we're using a lot more toilet paper. That's probably what it is. And it's just like the simplest thing. It's like, yeah, if you would cut my time of teaching in half, give me 4 hours to teach a day and then 4 hours to plan, grade, all those things,
Yeah.
and whatever, give me an extra month of school because make up the time, whatever you need to do. I definitely would have been able to deliver much better lessons, that's for sure.
Yep.
Because my lesson
Yep.
was always the last thing I would do at night before I'd go to bed, and after I did all this stuff, I was supposed to do
Yep.
the day. So I think you're absolutely right. And with that, I think it's perfectly into the final question here. As good educators, we want a backwards plan. So let's imagine the 2050. What do you think education should look like at that point in time? And you can be broad stroke,
Um,
nuts and bolts, whatever it is. Should there be a whole nother
yeah,
system
yeah.
at that point? And what do you think?
I think there should be an entirely different system. Um, like literally K through 16 should be different. Um, I think I think the skills that kids learn in schools, I think schools should be a lot more skill based as opposed to standards based. Because when you think about like jobs and things like that, at the end of the day is based on skills that you have, not necessarily like very few jobs are based on things that you actually know. It's like
Right.
what
It's not
skills you bring.
info based. Yeah.
Yeah, and like yes, you do have to learn certain things in order to access and tap into different skills. But I think it should be skill based as opposed to standards based. And I think the skills should be relevant to the community that you live in, as well as you should have the opportunity to learn skills that are not relevant to your community in case you want to leave your community.
Right.
I think the funding model should fully change. I think schools whose zip codes have the fewest home ownership should have the most funding. That's like so basic. And schools that have higher zip codes and higher, SES around the school to get the least amount of funding because they can supplement a lot of their funding in ways that like a
Sure.
school in the 30349 zip code, like, nah, we struggling versus like if I'm in a 303, like I can't even think of zip code in Buckhead by the governor's mansion.
Somewhere in Buckhead, yeah.
Yeah, like we'll be good. Like, cool.
Right.
Cut that program. Cool. The parents, we can easily give that.
Yeah.
And then honestly, the most radical thing I think on a somewhat regular basis is we somewhat need to resegregate. And when I say that because the thing I've learned from a lot of elders in my family, like a lot of just people, is that like a lot of Black people during that time period of like the civil rights, they didn't necessarily want to integrate schools. They just wanted like true equality. They're just like, yo, just give us the same resources and we'll be good. And because that never ever happened, and when you think about like post integration, like I think it was like 38,000 Black teachers lost jobs. Like who knows how many like bus drivers, cafeteria workers, all this stuff lost jobs. And then boom, you just put poverty in so many communities to like this day that are still problems. You put people out of work. And I think if we were to like fully resegregate and like actually like teach our true history and then at some point come back into society, I think you would see the playing field be a lot more leveled. You would see opportunities be a lot more easily accessible. And you would see people think different thoughts. Because, you know, for the most part, like kids are still like the big one of the, and this is off topic, but something that's just mind blowing to me is like the concept of Africa being a continent. So many kids think it's a country simply because not even just education, but because of America. Right. Nowhere on the US Census does it say European American. Right. But there's a thing because they know Europe has a lot of different countries and we got to make sure we break this down into Polish, into French, into all of this stuff to delineate the difference between a country and a continent. And when I think about the fact that like African American is a regular term that people just digest, but it's like, yo, Africa is not a country. Like we shouldn't, like, yes, some people say Asian American, but for the most part, you break it down into like Japanese American, Vietnamese American. But like, you don't hear too many people talking about Nigerian American. Like you might just hear he's Nigerian. Right. You might just hear he is Kenyan, South African. But and like when I think about like just that one simple concept, it makes so much just be exposed on how like, yo, we need to fully like get rid of the system as is because it is a failure to America. And, you know, it's the reason why we can have people like Donald Trump still have a potential to rerun. Right. And like people are conscious of the fact that like, yo, this is like a bad thing, but like he could still come back because people's minds are not right. At the end of the day, people's minds are not right. And the things that we know and believe and knowledge turns into belief systems. It has to be undone to start changing thoughts and start changing beliefs.
Yeah, I think that's so powerful. And there's a lot that you touch on that I personally also believe wholeheartedly. And I think the way I've sort of approached it with using that example is a lot of times we try to shove every good idea we've ever had into the current system, and then they all come together and get muddied and nothing works. It's like social emotional learning is a great concept and needs to happen. But it shouldn't happen just on top of, it shouldn't be like another scoop of ice cream in your math class, right? Like we should be decoupling some of these things. And if we want to, like, we want to teach actual history based off different identifiers, then we should do that intentionally, right? If we want to teach kids empathy, we should teach them empathy explicitly and intentionally, as opposed to trying to be like, today we're going to learn about trigonometry and I'm going to sneak an empathy and the word problem into your side. Yeah, and it all comes back to being on the teacher's shoulders, like, you know, become the expert at this too. So I think you make a lot of good points. I'm definitely gonna hit you up about this because I'm working on a paper of a new system design that I think you'd be interested in, could have some valuable input on. But this has been really awesome, Ray. Your experiences and perspective is super valuable. I also appreciate you not holding back and sharing some really good ideas. So
Yeah.
I'll finish by saying thank you for being a part of this and being one of our guests in the Insight conversation. And I look forward to posting and having everybody else take a look.
My pleasure, man. Appreciate the opportunity.